Well, thank you all for joining us today. We'll be talking about Puget Sound kelp forests, and I'm glad there has seemed so much interest. Kelp is really, really cool. And our speaker is Jeff Whitty, who is an ecologist with academic training in marine science and a special interest in conservation of imperiled species. Jeff is the Kelp Program Manager at the Northwest Straits Commission. In his position, he coordinates the Puget Sound Kelp Conservation and Recovery Plan, or the Kelp Plan. That's a better shortened version of it, I like that. And the Marine Resources Committee Floating Kelp Monitoring Project. Collaboration and community-based approaches are central pillars to Jeff's work, and so I'm excited to hear more about kelp today.
Thank you very much. Okay, as noted, can everybody hear me okay first? Perfect. My name is Jeff Whitty. I am the Kelp Program Manager for the Northwest Straits Commission. I am wondering, how many of you have heard of the Northwest Straits Commission? Ah, good number. Awesome. Well, we are a smaller organization. We have about maybe 10 staff or so. And to explain what we are a quasi-governmental, non-regulatory state commission, which makes it super clear, I know. The one thing I want to tell you, and the thing that I think it makes us really cool and unique, is that we take a bottom-up approach to marine conservation, and we do that through working with 7 marine resources committees, or MRCs. We help fund them, we help support them, we help coordinate them, and basically we just work with them as partners. The MRCs themselves are county-based, county-elected groups of volunteers that act as county advisors with marine conservation issues, and also take on a slew of marine conservation projects, which vary between the MRCs. You can see all 7 of them here. The closest one you have here is Whatcom County. Each of these MRCs, like I said, they take on different projects, and the projects can be from derelict vessel removal, prevention, forage fish monitoring and beach restoration, Olympia oyster restoration, kelp monitoring, and so on and so on and so on. And they take, like I said, they take on volunteers. So if you're ever interested in becoming more involved in your marine conservation in your local areas, look up the MRCs and see if they can take on any more volunteers. They are very good groups to work with. And let's see if this works. Nope, it doesn't. That's all right. I can go without notes. And so my role at the Northwest Straits Commission is as Kelp Program Manager. And as the Program Manager, I have 2 main projects I coordinate. One is the MRC Kelp Kayak Monitoring Program, where the MRCs go out in kayaks during the summer and basically do loops around kelp beds that they have chosen and have a GPS, and then they're able to calculate the area of that bed. They do this year after year so they can observe the trends in those kelp beds. The other thing I coordinate is called the Puget Sound Kelp Conservation and Recovery Plan, also known as the Kelp Plan. And with this, I work closely with a lot of kelp researchers, policy planners, tribes, educators, and so on and so forth to advance conservation and recovery. And I'll talk about that in addition to the work I do with the MRCs later on. So I'm here to talk to you all about kelp and kelp forests. How many of you know a reasonable amount about kelp? Okay, sweet. So I'm going to go pretty quick through this first part. But in my talk today, I'm going to get everybody on the same page. So I'm going to start off with kind of like a Kelp 101. I'll take a quick break, see if you have any, like a question or two, and then I'll hop into the second part of my talk, which will be more about what is happening with kelp and Puget Sound and what people are doing with it. So I'm talking to you about kelp, but really what I'm talking to you about is the kelp forest. And I really want to kind of immerse you in this forest and get you to understand what kelp forest truly is. And I find the best way to do this is by starting on land with a terrestrial forest. So if you'll bear with me, I'm going to take this time to take a tour through our kelp and terrestrial forests. So just imagine in your minds the last time you were in your favorite spot in the forest, whether it's Olympic Peninsula, the North Cascades, or locally here in Whatcom County, and you're walking through those forests. And just imagine those tall trees on either side of you, whether it's a Douglas fir or cedar. And as you're looking up those tall trees, as you get close to the sky, you see those branches coming together and the leaves intertwining. And as you're looking up, what you're seeing is the canopy of that forest. And as you look through that canopy, you start seeing that sunlight coming through that forest. And then you might see some birds flying by. And as you come down those big tall trunks, you might see like a squirrel perched on a branch or the trunks themselves. And as you come down to the forest floor, you might start seeing a bunch of understory plants, whether it be small plants, ferns, bushes, or whatnot. And if you peek behind one of those ferns, you might see a raccoon or a rabbit. And if you're really lucky and you stand there quiet enough, a deer might run by you, right? We've all had that experience. So now imagine that whole situation, but underwater. And so now instead of walking through that forest, you're swimming through the forest. And instead of seeing those big, tall trees, now you're seeing big, giant kelp, bull kelp or giant kelp reaching up. And as you look up those tall trunks, or what they're called stipes, toward the canopy surface, you are now seeing blades, or the leaves, if you will, of those kelp coming together for that canopy surface. You're still seeing that sun trickling down through that canopy, but instead of seeing birds up there at the top, now you're seeing schools of herring or other forage fish or even juvenile salmon swimming along the canopy of that forest. And if you come back down those kelp stipes, instead of seeing the squirrels, you might see a kelp crab, hooded nudibranch, or other critter. And then as you come down to the forest floor, now instead of seeing the understory plants, you are seeing a high diversity of understory kelp, and not just kelp, but other species as well. In Puget Sound, we have roughly 20 species of understory kelp, which I'll explain a bit in just, I think, next. That is a crazy amount of kelp for one place to have. And then if you look in the understory kelp, instead of seeing a rabbit or raccoon, you might see a juvenile rockfish, which is its critical habitat for, or a sea star. And if you instead of seeing that deer run by you, you might see one of these staring at you, a nice little harbor seal with those big black eyes. And if you take a step back and look at the whole system as an ecosystem, you can see how complex it is, how many animals and critters and algae come together to create this environment, and how much they depend upon the kelp. So hopefully that gives you an idea of what a kelp forest is and how important it is, and we'll kind of dive off from there. So I'm going to go in, again, really quick. Look like a lot of you knew about kelp. I'm just going to give you some basics really quickly. First of all, what is kelp? So kelp is a type of seaweed, which is a type of algae, a macroalgae or a big algae. A lot of people refer to kelp as plants. I am going to refer to them as plants. They are not plants. They are an entirely different kingdom. They are types of algae. And so while all kelps are types of seaweeds, not all seaweeds are types of kelps. In seaweeds, there are three main groups: the browns, the greens, and yellows. Browns, greens, and reds, sorry. And it is generally the brown algae, so the brown macroalgae, that are what we call the kelp. But like plants, they do photosynthesize, and they have very similar structures. So how many of you have been out on the water and seen kelp? Okay, how many of you have been under the water and seen kelp? Less, but a good number, that's great. So if you've been out in the water and you've seen kelp floating on the surface, that is bull kelp. That is what people often refer to as kelp, and they only think about as kelp because everything else, except for the giant kelp on the coast, is underwater. It's out of sight and out of mind. In Washington, we have 22 species. There's an amazing poster by Andrea Dingledine, which is, you can see it up there, which represents the 22 species we have in Washington. We have 17 of these in Puget Sound. Only 2 of them go to the surface. All the other ones we don't see, and we know far less about, and we really need to focus on these understory kelps. Although there are 22 different species, their blueprints are very similar to each other for the most part. If you can see, let's see if this mouse works. Yep, does that show up? Yeah. So this bottom part right here is kind of like the anchor of the kelp. It's called the holdfast. You can see a better picture here. It looks like a big root structure. It is not a root. It is simply there to hold the kelp down to the bottom and grab onto usually rocky substrate. Sometimes if they're really big and really wide, they can grab onto sand, especially if there's worms, like tube worms underneath that hold on to. But typically, they need to hold on to a rocky substrate because they're in very complex, dynamic, and energetic areas where if they weren't holding down, they'd get knocked out of place. Coming up from that holdfast, we have what we call the stipe. I said these were trunks, these are stipes. And they do vary quite a bit between the species. This right here is a sea palm. You find these out on the coast in more intertidal areas, and they get vast around And so they're going to have a little bit more of a robust stipe, where if you look at a bull kelp, it's got a very elongated stipe so it can reach the surface of the water. And then speaking of bull kelps, giant kelps, feather boas, these are the few that actually have these bulbs or these floats which allow them to reach the surface and stay on the surface of the water. Most species don't have those. And then in addition to that, we finally have the leaves, or what we call the blades of the kelps. Bull kelps have a very long blade. And if you look on their blades in, say, August, September, you're going to start seeing these brown patches, which we call psoriasaurus. These are the asexual reproductive parts of the plants, and just one of two life stages of kelp. So kelp is a very complex thing, and it has a complex life cycle. I am not going to go into it because that's a whole nother talk, but I will say that they are perennial or annual, depending on the species. And what I'm going to focus on is the life cycle of the bull kelp, because again, we know most about it. With the bull kelp, and actually most species of kelp, they have two life cycles. They have a sporophyte phase, which is what you probably all know. It's the part you see. It's the big part of kelp. And then they have the sori on the sporophyte, which are their asexual reproductive part. It releases spores, which then create the gametophyte, which is the second stage, which is pretty much microscopic, which then come together to create a sporophyte. With bull kelp, these the little tiny sporophytes form in late winter, early spring, I believe. Very, very tiny, but they grow very, very fast. And by June, typically they reach the surface of the water. And if you look at this map right here, this is created by one of our MRCs. This is apart from their kayak monitoring program. His name's Carter Webb. He's also a student. And he went out along with his team and he kayaked in June, July, August, and September. And so right here, this kind of purplish color, that is the kelp bed in June. And then you can see by July, it's grown quite a bit, especially this big red area right here. And then August, it grows a little bit more. In September, it's the biggest they see it. And then usually September, October, they start to senesce. They start to break apart. Hold fast, release sometimes, especially with storm. The blades just kind of deteriorate. And over the winter, you usually don't see kelp or bull kelp. Sometimes they last, sometimes they don't. But it's in the winter that you see the gametophytes start popping up because those sori release their spores typically in the late summer, fall period. So one thing too about kelp, with like bull kelp, it appears in the summer, it dies off in the winter. And each year, it varies quite a bit in the size and density. It's an extremely variable type of algae, where it increases in area and density year to year. And we have been tracking that for multiple beds throughout Washington, and not just Northwest Straits Commission, the MRCs, but a number of other groups. And we've compiled all that. Or I should say DNR, Washington DNR has, and created the Washington State Floating Kelp Indicator. And so what they have done is they've taken all the different monitoring from different groups, including DNR, Samish Indian Nation, and MRCs, and piled them together to create this map. And so each dot is a studied site with the trend for that specific site. And then these little polygons are basically, they took the trends for each site and created a general trend for a sub-basin within Washington. So this is southern Puget Sound, Central Sound, San Juans, and so on and so forth. And just really quickly, I'm going to show you kind of what is happening with bull kelp, because this is primarily looking at bull kelp and giant kelp in Washington. So down in the Central and Southern Sound, the reds, that means these areas are significantly declining over the long period of time. And so a lot of these beds in here are declining or have disappeared completely. The ones here in green are what we call stable, because they are not significantly increasing or decreasing. They're kind of holding still. Again, they still have a lot of variability, but over the long period, there's no significant trend. These areas in yellows and orange, where we are, don't have enough data to make a call on the trend. But using traditional ecological knowledge from groups like Samish Indian Nation, there is reason to be concerned because they have seen somewhat of a decline through there. We're still working on it, though. What you don't see here is the understory kelp, those 20 other species that are really important. again, they've been out of mind. We haven't paid a lot of attention to them until recently, where groups like Reef Check and Seattle Aquarium, Samish Indian Nation, and some other tribes have really started pumping in energy and effort to better understanding these and monitoring these. So hopefully soon we will have a map or something similar like this to track those as well. So the question is, why? Why are some of these populations decreasing or declining? And the answer is stressors. These are basically human and climate-induced factors that negatively affect kelp, and there are a lot that we think of. We're still very early to try and figure these out, but we do have a good idea of what might be doing it. One is temperature. Bull kelp, for one, does not like temperatures around 16 to 18 degrees Celsius, which a lot of the Puget Sound doesn't reach during the summer times, but places like Squaxin Island in the south can reach that in like for weeks on end. And that is where kelp is really hurting. Another one is shade. If you put, like again, kelp is kind of like a plant, they photosynthesize. So if you reduce the light getting down to kelp, they're not going to do as well. So you put a dock on top of one, might not do as well. If you increase the sediment, the free floating sediment in the water, you're going to decrease the light, not going to do as well. Bottom type, kind of related to what I was saying with the free floating sediment. If you have a lot of sediment go into the water from runoff or whatever cause, and you create a change in the bottom habitat from a substrate that's based on rock to sand, you're going to decrease the habitat for kelp. Another one is grazers. How many of you have heard about the urchin problem with kelp in California? Yeah, a good amount of you. They've had a boom of urchins because a lot of the predators that prey on the urchins have decreased. And so they have got a ton of urchins, they've mowed down their kelp beds, and so now their kelp beds are really struggling. We're lucky that we do not necessarily have that problem here in Puget Sound, but we do have kelp crabs. Kelp crabs do eat kelp, hence partly the name. But that is not a call to go out and kill all the kelp crabs. They are native, they are supposed to be there, but it's something we do want to keep an eye on. Physical damage, you can think if you go out on a boat, you throw an anchor out to the kelp bed, you're going to be ripping up that kelp bed. Probably not the most conducive to that kelp bed. Also, if you have a boat and you run through it with your propeller, kelp salad. So you're just going to be very careful. You want to go and visit the kelp beds because they are amazing, but just be very careful in handling your vessels when around a kelp bed. And the last one I want to mention, but is definitely not the last potential stressor, is the water quality and specifically nutrients. Kelp are kind of like the Goldilocks of the algae. They don't like nutrients too high or too low. They need to have it just in the middle. So why do we care, though? Why do we care about kelp? It's just that green slimy thing in the water, right? Well, hopefully one of my first slides showed you some importance of kelp. Kelp is a building block, basically, of our ecosystem. It is a very important, vital habitat. It is an important habitat to rockfish. It's actually a critical habitat to juvenile rockfish of some species. It's an important habitat for forage fish and salmon because it provides sanctuary and foraging grounds. It's also the base of a food web for many organisms. Kelp crabs eat them, urchins, abalone eat kelp, other things eat them, and it works the way up the food chain all the way up to the killer whales. They are also important to the lifeways of local cultures. Many cultures have consumed kelp for many years and also depend upon the life that the kelp support. So this is just the tip of the iceberg of what we know of how kelp is important and how it affects us. A lot of people don't understand that kelp does have a direct link to our livelihoods as well. We are part of the ecosystem, and so it's very important to realize that when thinking of kelp. So I'm going to take a break because I know that was a bit of information. I want to see if anybody has a question or two before we proceed to the next part. Yes?
Yeah, what was bottom type again for that last slide?
So, yeah, bottom type. So stressors. Kelp uses their holdfast to hold on to rocky substrates. And so if you have extra sediment go into the water, like a good example of this is, I don't know if you saw the breakdown of the Elwha Dam. It released a ton of sediment into the water. And it buried the kelp because there's so much. But it also created basically beaches where rock used to be. So in that type of environment, you are decreasing the availability of habitat for kelp. Great question. Yes? What is the strength of the stipe, basically? How much wave action can it be put up with? A lot. I could not tell you exactly what poundage. I mean, I've been, beach, you play tug of war with the bull kelp. They're pretty strong. It's usually like during in the late season where things start breaking apart that they start to weaken. But you will probably find more kelp in areas of high currents than in low currents. That's just the type of environment they like. And so they've developed the ability to withstand those. So they do have quite a bit of strength to them. Great question. We'll take one more. Yes?
Is it 22 species of bull kelp, or is it just...
No, great question. Is it 22 species of bull kelp? No, there is one species of bull kelp that we have in Puget Sound. It's 22 species of kelp in Washington. So I'll go ahead and move on, but I'll take questions afterwards as well. If that's okay with you? Works? All right. So now this part of the conversation is we have an idea of what's happening with kelp, right? We're going to move on to see what are we doing about it. And one thing I want to point out is, we're starting to see what's happening with kelp and where, and we're seeing that there are declines. We are at the early stages of understanding why these are happening, and we really need to work more to figure out what those stresses are and how they affect kelp and what we can do about it. So we are at a really critical point that we need to come together as a community, not just the algae people or the fish people, but Washington in general, to really push forward to support kelp conservation, because by conserving kelp, you're basically helping to conserve the Puget Sound and everything it supports, including us. A really good step forward in the community coming together to support kelp was the Puget Sound Kelp Conservation and Recovery Plan, again, just Kelp Plan. And this was published in 2020, and basically it was the gathering of 40-plus organizations, groups, individuals coming together to try and identify what we need to do as a community to move kelp conservation recovery forward. And so what they came up with were 6 main goals and 65 actions that fall under those goals. I'm not going to go through those actions with you today, but I will highlight some of the goals. So the goals are understanding and reducing kelp stressors, understanding ecosystem value of kelp, or basically why kelp is valuable to the ecosystem as well as us, describing kelp distribution trends, so where is kelp and how is it doing, designating kelp protected areas, restoring kelp forest, and promoting awareness, engagement, and action. So the next couple slides, I'm going to be going through some of these and kind of giving you an idea of who's doing what with these and just kind of celebrating some of the wins, because we always need to celebrate those wins, as small as they might be. So the first one is kelp stressors. So what are we doing with kelp stressors? Well, groups like Puget Sound Institute, in partnership with groups like Washington Fish and Wildlife and other partners, are really doing amazing work with IDing kelp stressors and figuring out what risk they pose to kelp and where they're located. In fact, they're creating a map to show the main sources of some of these stressors to kelp, which is going to be vital when we want to try to manage them. Other groups like Friday Harbor Labs for UW worked on looking at environmental factors that affect kelp, specifically nutrients and temperature. Robin Fales and Brooke Weigel were 2 people that worked on this, and they have a series of papers out, and what they found was that bull kelp doesn't like those temperatures of about 16 to 18 degrees or 61 to 64 degrees Fahrenheit. And then lastly, we have basically a current study. They did the field work already, but they're working up the analyses that are looking at the effects of understory kelp on bull kelp. So basically competition between the kelps, because you got to have competition for nutrients, competition for light, and other resources. So that'll be a very interesting study to watch. Another one is ecosystem value. Again, what is the value of kelp to everything around it? With killer whales, they have a behavior they called kelping. It's basically where you take some kelp, you can see in this picture here, in the mouth of the killer whale, and they kind of just play with it and mouth it. There was a paper recently that came out, and they found a new behavior called allokelping. And what this is they take a piece of bull kelp, a certain size, and they place it between themselves and another killer whale, and they kind of rub each other with it. and they go and they pick it up and do it again and again. And apparently this is only seen in southern resident killer whales. So that's pretty cool. It's a very local behavior and shows you the importance of kelp to killer whales. Another thing is being studied is the dependence of kelp on forage fish and salmon. Dr. Ann Schaefer has done a lot of work, I think over the last 10 years in freshwater bay out on the Strait of Juan Fuca, looking at the interactions between these, and now they're taking that study, working with UW and others to really expand it throughout Puget Sound. So that'll be very exciting to see exactly what they come up with there. Kelp restoration is another goal that we're focusing on, and there's an amazing group called Puget Sound Restoration Fund. If you haven't heard of them before, I'll look into them. PSRF, they do restoration of oysters, abalone, kelp, and pretty much more. But they are working with a lot of the local tribes, some of the counties, and other partners to look at improving kelp restoration techniques so they can use that information when it becomes time to do mass outplantings and mass restoration. You can see right here, this is one of their techniques where they seed little lines, which they then, seed it with kelp, bull kelp, and then they put it out on these cables. Over time, it'll then grow into these little tiny sporophytes, bull kelp, which will then grow into full-on forests. They've been very successful with this. In fact, it's really exciting to say that their kelp forests have started to reproduce. So I think it was last year, the year before, the kelp that they put out actually reproduced and created kelp to come up the next year. So that's a very, something to celebrate, a very cool thing. They are also working on seed banking with a lot of the tribes. So basically taking kelp genetic material and put it aside so they can use it for future work if needed. It's kind of like a Noah's Ark for kelp. Distribution and trends, better understanding where kelp is and how it's doing is probably one of the more advanced goals that we have. We've had a lot more work in this because usually this is going to be one of the first things you're going to do in conservation. You've got to understand what's happening before you can figure out if something needs to be saved and how. So this largely deals with monitoring. And monitoring kelp is not new. Tribes have been doing this forever. But what's really cool is now we can, the tribes can take their indigenous knowledge and interweave it with other monitoring, including aerial monitoring from satellites, planes, and drones, to kayak monitoring, which is being done by county groups or community groups like the MRCs, tribes, nonprofits, and then even with underwater monitoring from scuba and remote operated vehicles, which is done by Seattle Aquarium or Reef Check, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But Reef Check basically trains volunteer divers, so if you're interested, to do kelp surveys underwater. And at this point, I'm going to do a quick video so you can get a better idea of some of the monitoring that the MRC is doing at a very local level. And even though it's a very local level, this program has been very beneficial in helping with the kelp conservation and monitoring. And again, their data that's happened or being taken at a local level is used on the state level. So hopefully this will work.
Kelp is a really important habitat for a great many species. It is an annual, so it starts out every spring just as a tiny little plant that grows very, very rapidly and then forms a forest that is important for rockfish and the juveniles of many species, crab and salmon, and etc. The idea of trying to figure out what's happening with it is really important because it helps us do a better job of taking care of the species that we really want to preserve in Puget Sound.
Within the Northwest Straits Initiative, there are 7 county-based marine resources committees, and you refer to them as MRCs. Each one is made up of citizen volunteers And their primary objectives are to advise their county commissioners on marine resource matters in their county and identify issues that come up related to nearshore and marine ecosystems. And they develop projects around those concerns and try to tackle them through things such as the Kelp Survey Project.
The information that we're trying to gather is we want to know the size and the shape of the bed. And so we use a GPS meter and we set it so that it's tracking our movements. And we kayak around the bed and that gives us the shape of the bed and the exact location of it. And during that track, on 2 points, at the farthest from the shore and the closest to the shore, we take depth measurements. And then we also do a temperature measurement in there too, and we take photographs at 4 points.
By gaining that knowledge, I think that we're going to be able to be much more able to assess how environmental factors are impacting kelp beds on a fine scale. Citizen science is a great way for our local folks to have a strong connection to our environment.
Back it goes.
I think it's really important for people to be able to get outside and do work that is both meaningful to them and they understand the importance of it for protecting the natural environment. And this is a great project to be able to do that.
Okay, there you go. 23 species, not correct, but that's all right. I do have to say that we do have our good years and bad years with kelp. Last year, 2025, was a record-breaking year for the kayakers. At least 10 of their 26 bed had the biggest areas, or second biggest areas they've ever seen, which is awesome. But as I've told them, we can't be complacent because kelp beds are highly variable. We have an amazing year this year, and it could be bad next year. So it's another thing to celebrate in this crazy world that we call kelp. And so the last thing I do want to end on is the goal of education and engagement. This is probably one of the ones I feel is most important. People can't really care about something they don't know about, and they're not going to protect something they don't care about. So by basically promoting kelp through things like presentations, social media, and getting the eye of the public on kelp, letting them know it's out there, and seeing if they will care, and then if they do care, they can make the choice to conserve or not. But just getting them that information out there is really, really important. And luckily, this goal is one of the more advanced goals. There's more happening with this than some of the other ones. We're still very early on the Kelp Plan, so some haven't come along as far. But one of the reasons this one is because it's interweaved in all the other goals. So that's a pretty cool thing. But you can do this through so many things like in outreach, social media. This was a social media campaign we had last year, which was really successful on the Kelp and Kelp Plan. San Juan Island had an art exhibit on kelp, which was awesome. It was very successful. And then something cool is this last year, students at Seattle Aquarium, PSRF, and others went and got bull kelp to be the state marine forest adopted by Washington. And when they did this, the governor surprised them by dedicating April 16th to be Bull Kelp Day. So if you need an excuse to celebrate bull kelp or kelp in general or go out and educate, this is the day to do it. And that kind of brings us to my final slide. How can you help, right? There are so many things you can do, and as students, you are in such a powerful position to do something. Research. If you're interested in research, being at a university, you have easier access than many people do. And you've seen how much amazing stuff we've done with kelp. We are still so early on. We need so much more help. and research is a key priority for a lot of this work. So if you're interested, reach out. Feel free to call me or email me. Next slide will have that information. I'm happy to try and set you up with what is out there. There's volunteer positions. Sometimes there's internships. We do what we can. But another thing is volunteering if you have the abilities with the MRCs. Again, you can call up the MRCs, see if they have any spots for their kayak teams. Whatcom County is one of our teams that does go out and monitors 4 different sites, 2 on Lummi Island, 1 at Point Whitehorn, and 1 at Gulf Road, Cherry Point. Reef Check, another volunteer group that trains already trained divers, but trains volunteer divers to survey kelp. They've got teams throughout entire Washington. It's an amazing group as well. And then this thing, which you probably can't even read, but if you go to PSRF, Puget Sound Restoration Fund's amazing website, you can learn even more about what or how you can help. And this is broken down based on like what you do, what your interests are. So if you are a boater, if you are a seafood eater, if you are a car owner, if you're a parent, this tells you a couple of ideas of what you can do. So there is a lot of stuff that you as students, as you as community members can do to help kelp, and we really need as much help as we can get. So with that, do you have any questions?
Do you have any like outdoor education curriculums to teach like younger students about kelp and the importance of those impacts? Or is
So-
that like maybe on the plan or?
Do we have any curriculum for schools about kelp? That is a great question. There is an individual that is currently working on that, but if you go to, I don't have the exact site on me, NOAA has an amazing page for kelp with a lot of resources. I believe they might have some curriculum. They definitely have a lot of resources you can use in classrooms. Awesome question. And I know you had a question before.
Yes. So, what is the part of the kelp that's in between the blades and the stipe?
What's between the blades and the stipe? It depends on the kelp. Sometimes nothing. Sometimes it is like this. That's the bulb. Is the easy way, the float. But again, that's mostly just on bull kelp. Giant kelp also have bulbs, as do feather boa. So yeah.
This question is from one of our online viewers. They say, thanks for the excellent presentation. For the kelp restoration using lines, are there any negative impacts on the lines themselves where they see the kelp?
Any negative impacts on the environment or?
I had that kind of question too. Like if you're putting lines in the water, I can think of entanglement for various things. So what happens? So they grow on the lines, but then when they're reproducing, are those wolves reproducing growing on the lines? Are the lines still there? Do the lines eventually go away?
That's a great question that they could answer. So from what I know is, yes, they go out and the lines are cables. So entanglement, and they're also just off the bottom, which kind of helps with competition from other things. And so I have not heard of any negative issues with them. But they are constantly revising their techniques to see how they can improve upon it. And so, yeah, I'm sure as they get better and better, it's going to get better and better. But I haven't heard of any negative impacts. But again, PSRF, that's people to ask. They're on top of it. Yes?
Aside from harvesting kelp for cultural purposes, is there commercial kelp harvesting or kelp farming in Puget Sound?
Great question.
Source of many useful food products and industrial products.
Yes. Question was, is there commercial kelp farming in Washington? Yes. Until 2 years ago, there was only one farm. That had been, I don't know, I can't tell you how long that one's been there. But as of, like 2 years ago, a series of farms went through the permitting process, which is somewhat of a new thing for Washington, so it took a little while. There is now one, the previous one I believe was in Hood Canal. There's now one on Lummi Island, and there's one that's in the permitting process near Vashon Island. Canada does have a lot of commercial farming, but Washington, we're just getting started. Yes?
Is kelp photosynthesis different from plant photosynthesis?
That's a very good question. Is plant photosynthesis different than algae photosynthesis? Honestly, I could not tell you. But, yeah.
I know that in like Oregon and California, they are working on recovering certain species specifically to help benefit like kelp's recovery. But do you know in Washington if there's certain species that have like a positive effect on the kelp and that their recovery might help the kelp forest come back?
Great question. Are there, I'm trying to rephrase this, are there species that are beneficial to kelp that we're trying to bring back? Is that correct? Okay. So yes, to a degree. One of the species that you're probably talking about is the sunflower sea star, Pycnopodia. Friday Harbor Labs is actually raising them and releasing them in Puget Sound. And so sunflower sea stars feed on urchins. So that is one way to help try and keep the urchin population in check. But beyond that, I can't think of anything else. Sea otters are another one that helps keep the urchins in check. And I know in BC, they do have more of an urchin problem, more towards the coast, and they had a rebound in in sea otters. And I think it was like the next year or something, their kelp had bounced back. It was amazing. So it really shows you the effect of, just the interactions in the environment and how much they can change things. Great question. Any other questions?
Another question from online. So you mentioned the impacts on kelp and water quality, like high sediment loads. What about conditions with very high phytoplankton blooms in the water? Example, red tides. Will the blooms impact kelp from shading, nutrient uptake, etc.?
Yes, also amazing questions here today. So that is one of the main problems with high nutrients is that you get these big algae blooms that will outcompete the kelp. So yes, they'll grow faster, decrease lighting. It is an issue. Yeah.
What are some of the products? You mentioned there's farms now. I've eaten a few kelp pickles, but what are we talking about?
Well, that's the interesting question, actually. What do we do with this kelp? So long time ago, they were actually using it or trying to use it for, I believe, as potash on farms. And that's actually how we have some of our historical information is back in like 1930s, they did a massive survey for kelp for that very reason. Various kelps and algae are used for various things. It's not just all kelp. Sometimes it's the red algae. And so it depends on who you ask. So in Washington, we don't really produce enough. This is from my understanding talking with the farmers. We don't produce enough for the really big uses of kelp, which I'm guessing might be for farming. And so and then the little niche things, like, I don't know if you've had sea pickles, which are delicious. I hate to say it, I'm not a fan of kelp, but sea pickles, they taste great. But yeah, so just things like that, or one of the farms here has kind of like chips made out of kelp type of thing. But they're looking to try and figure out what the market is between these smaller niche things and the very big, large uses, which our Washington kelp farms can enter, kind of like a medium-sized market. And so they're kind of playing around with that. But if you've ever had sushi, not a kelp, but what's wrapped around the side of it is a type of algae. So.
Sort of like sea salt, like they use, not sea salt, but they break it up and dry it, and then you put that like as salt instead of salt you use.
Yes. And in fact, I've had a beer with kelp in it. So you name it, they make it.
They have some complex carbohydrate substances in them that are used in the food industry as thickeners, and there's some interesting work going on now feeding dairy cattle seaweed to kelps, and it somehow reduces the methane production from the cows, which is important for climate change. So
Yes, I believe that's a type of red algae. I can't remember the name of it, but yes. Sure. But there is also, basically what you're talking about, there's a lot of other algae that are in things like dynamite, ice cream, things you just wouldn't think of. And it's kind of like the bonding agent that they're used for, from my understanding. So.
Well, I think they also use like certain types of algae for supplements.
Yes, yeah, if you go into the local like juice stores, you'll see, yeah, various things in there.
Someone wants to know, what is the gas in the bulb?
What is the gas in the bulb? You know what? I actually just went to a talk on this, and I can't remember what it is. But that's an amazing question. Okay.
One thing I always find fascinating about kelp is how fast they grow. So isn't it something like up to a foot a day?
Yeah, so how fast do kelp grow? It's going to depend on the species, obviously, but if we're talking about like giant kelp or bull kelp, I've seen anything from a foot to 2 feet a day, with most suggesting about 18 inches, so in between. 16 inches.
Literally watch it grow.
Yeah, it grows very, very fast.
Along those lines, how deep are these forests? Is this happening in 10 or 20 or 30 feet water?
That's a great question. There's actually a slide I took out. Where do kelp forests occur? They are primarily near shore waters, typically around 30 feet or so, because they're dependent upon light. Some of these species can grow up to 100, 150 feet, so that also gives you an idea of how deep they can go. But it just depends on how much, well, not only, but a large thing that stops where they can grow is how much light can get to them. So, yeah.
So this person says, I've heard the too large kelp are great for sequestering carbon. If yes, does the carbon then get released when the kelp forest dies off?
That's the $10 million question. Basically, does kelp help with carbon uptake and sequestration? And that is something that a lot of people are studying now. A lot of people have commented on now. Yes, kelp takes carbon in really rapidly. But the question is, what happens with that carbon once the kelp dies off? With eelgrass and actual plants, they can sequester that through their roots. These don't have roots. So with sequestration, what I was told is the definition of sequestration is it has to be basically taken out of the system for over 100 years. So with bull kelp, when they, deteriorate, they might be eaten by other organisms, and so it remains in the system. They might wash on shore as kelp rack and deteriorate, go into the soil, be eaten by other creatures, or they might go into the deep sea, fall down, and then that is a potential source or a way for them to sequester that carbon. But there's a lot of work that needs to go into this. I am definitely not an expert on this, but there's a lot of people that are talking about it.
We have time for about one more question. Anybody has one?
Yes.
When did bull kelp start to decline the most rapidly?
Whew, that is a great question. When did bull kelp start to decline? So I couldn't really answer that. In Puget Sound, in the south and central Puget Sound, what they did, again, they took those surveys from like the 1930s, and then they compared it with more recent surveys in the area, which I can't, DNR's done them, and I can't remember when they started them. There's actual paper on this, but comparing that to the old data to new data, you can see a decline. So over the last 100 years or so. However, we're still seeing this today. The MRCs, in fact, here, I'll show you. I think I always keep extra slides. Okay, so Snohomish MRC, right here, whoops. This is the northern tip of central Puget Sound. That's where it's shaded in red because it's declining. And then you got Mukilteo and Meadowdale above it. These two sites, the MRC started monitoring in 2015. And then in 2018 and 2019, after a decline, They completely disappeared. And since then, they do continue to go out and monitor to see if they'll come back, but they only get a couple bulbs a year at these sites. So this is a great example that it's still happening on our noses. And just last year, Skagit County at, do you know what the Anacortes Ferry is? If you look just to your left, there used to be a bed right there, up to last year. And so last year, we saw a decline since I think 2019, 2020. It's gotten smaller and smaller and smaller and then disappeared. The bed right next door is doing great. It's been actually increasing for the 4 last years. So it shows you how variable these things are. Even neighboring beds are doing different things. So it shows you how complicated these things are. But yeah, good question.
Okay, I think that's probably a good time to cut it off. And I'm sure you have to stay up front if you want to come chat and have some more questions for him. Thank you.
Thanks.